Delia Ray Howard is a well-known author of books for middle grade readers. Her books have been inspired by incidents in history, and her writings bring fascinating pieces of history alive. Delia's 6 books include 3 nonfiction: Gold, The Klondike Adventure; A Nation Torn, the story of how the Civil War began; Behind the Blue and the Gray, the soldier's life in the Civil War; and 3 fiction books: Ghost Girl, A Blue Ridge Mountain Story; Singing Hands, and her most recent, Here Lies Link, which has Iowa City roots. Among her many awards, she received the American Library Association Notable Book Designation, the Bank Street College Children's Book of the Year designation, the Society of School Librarians International Book Award, a Book Sense Summer Children's Pick, and Ghost Girl was nominated for Children's Choice Award in 8 states. For the book Here Lies Link, she was awarded the Friends of American Writers 2012 Juvenile Literary Award, and the Maryland Black-Eyed Susan Award nominee, one of 10 books chosen. Delia recently joined the UNESCO City of Literature Board and will co-chair the One Book, Two Book Children's Book Festival in January of 2013. Delia Ray Howard and her husband Matt have 3 children: Caroline, Susanna, and Lily. Welcome to One of a Kind.
Thank you.
Your story begins, I know, in 1963 in Newport News, Virginia. And tell me just a little bit about your first family and their influence on you.
Well, let's see. When I was about 5 years old, my dad, who was an aeronautical engineer at NASA, decided to move us from the town suburbia in Yorktown, Virginia, across the river to Gloucester, which at that time seemed a million miles away. So we moved from our little ranch house to an old farmhouse that had been built in the 1800s. And so we moved there with my older brother and sister and had a lot of adventures on that place.
A lot of big acreage, I read.
Right.
150 acres?
150 acres.
That you got to roam around and...
Yes. And the thing that was a little bit difficult in the beginning is we had been used to having lots of neighbors to play with. And out in the country in Gloucester, we were sort of on our own. So my sister and a cousin who would visit every summer from Washington, D.C., we made the Brave Girls Club. Had 3 members, and we would challenge each other to do daring deeds. Like
what?
Like swim across the pond to the part that had the most algae, where the water snakes swam, and then to prove that you went to the deepest part of the pond, you had to dive down and get a handful of mud and swim back up. What else did we do? We climbed up to the top of the barn roof, which in August would be really hot because it was a tin roof. But the best thing we would do is explore old abandoned houses that were sort of scattered in that part of the state. I don't know why there were so many.
Which probably each house had its own story.
It did, and we would just sort of come across them in the woods or out in the field. And so part of the Brave Girl Challenge was that you had to go into this house one by yourself, and then to prove that you went in, you bring something back. And a lot of these houses, people had left furniture or old pictures, parts of scrapbooks and newspapers, and so we would get these little artifacts and then try to put together the story of who might have lived there. And so I think that had a big influence on what I like to write about in my books.
Before we get into your writing, your grandparents on your mother's side were deaf,
Yes.
and that is in the story of Singing Hands. Did you learn to sign, and did you write Singing Hands when your grandparents were still living?
Well, we all grew up signing. My grandfather was a wonderful teacher and would sit for hours just teaching us the alphabet and different signs for different words. But they had both passed away by the time I wrote that book. For some reason, it didn't occur to me, when it should have, that it would be a great book idea until they were already gone. And then how did that come about? I think every summer my mom would come with my girls and I on a trip to the Delaware shore, and we would have to cross the Chesapeake Bay, which if anybody's ever been across that bridge in the summer, in the height of beach season, sometimes can take hours. So my mother would tell the girls Birmingham stories of what it was like growing up in the 40s in Birmingham in the South, and being a hearing child of deaf parents and all the mischief that she and her friends and her sisters and brother would get into. And so then I had that idea.
And just a little aside, speaking of signing, tell the viewers about your famous actress aunt and signing.
My Aunt Louise. Well, Louise, who was the inspiration for the character of Margaret in the book, when she first read the book, I had to say, "You're nothing like Margaret." But Louise Fletcher is an actress who received an Academy Award for her role as Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And if anybody remembers those awards, she was the first person to sign her acceptance speech, where she thanked her parents for helping her dreams to come true. And those parents were Nanny and Pop, which were the inspiration for two characters in my book.
In Singing Hands.
Yes.
So when did you start? I mean, you had your Brave Club, very brave girls, but when did you decide that you started writing? Did you have a friend, the two of you?
Yes, my friend Carolyn Clark is my oldest and dearest friend. She moved from Maryland to this little town where we lived in Gloucester in about 4th grade. And we just were very much alike in that we would do kind of nerdy things like sit around and write poems. We would create our own Greek myths where we would make up Greek characters, and then we would write up these stories and poems and try to make people buy them. Which we didn't have many takers besides our parents. But I still have our stacks of notebooks where we had these poems and stories that we would trade back and forth. So that's when I first started.
Did you have a teacher in, grade school, junior high, high school who encouraged your writing?
I think my biggest influence of a teacher that I can remember is Gwyneth Whitaker, who was my junior year in high school English teacher. And she was just this wonderful, calm, very serious woman who would take huge amounts of time with our papers. And I still remember I had her for 2 years in a row, and for my big senior paper, here was the title of my big final project, was the role of sex, marriage, morality, and the modern woman in the works of Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy. Do you think that's a kind of big
in
subject?
Junior high?
No, that was when I was a senior. But it was ridiculous that I would take on this huge
and
topic.
You did it?
In the works of Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy. And that woman, it shows how patient she was to work with me on that and teach all the kids in her class what it took to edit and make writing perfect.
And then, so there was that teacher, and then you went to the University of Virginia and graduated. Do you have was that a good writing program at?
It was an excellent writing program. One of my professors there was John Casey, who was a very well-known writer who won the National Book Award, I think. And George Garrett was another instructor. It was a great place to learn about writing.
So what happened after graduation?
So after graduation, I went on to do a small summer graduate program at Radcliffe College. And it was for people who knew that they wanted to go into the publishing field. I had thought that I wanted to be a writer, but my father said, I think you better find a profession before you decide you're going to be a writer. So I decided the closest I could get to that was to become an editor. So this was a program that you had to apply to, where they reviewed writing and pieces I had done for the hospital magazine at the University of Virginia. And I got in, and all of those students, most of them migrated to New York afterwards to work in the publishing field. but by that time I had met my fiance, Matt, so I took a different direction.
And you went to the West Coast,
Yes.
is that? And then you were editing there, correct?
Right. I was, one of my instructors at Radcliffe was a man who was starting a small publishing firm. So that had been a big regret for me. I was very excited to go with Matt to Seattle, where he was doing his residency, but it wasn't exactly the publishing mecca.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that I had this close connection after the program at Radcliffe with this fellow who was starting this business was great, and I was his first employee.
And you had some interesting things you edited, I read, in the research about bear maulings.
Alaska Bear Tales, which became a huge bestseller in airports that were the true accounts told by people who had survived bear maulings. And we would call for these stories throughout the state of Alaska, and they would come in letter forms, or I would get a lot of audio tapes that I would have to sit and listen to and transcribe all these tales and then edit them.
Well, but that must have been quite fun.
That was fun compared to I had to write guides about nuclear waste management.
Now that probably wasn't too...
That wasn't as much fun. And the advanced guide to race walking, which I didn't know before then was an Olympic sport.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a great profession for on-the-job training.
I've got to ask you, and I think probably know partially the answer, because you were, when you were young, exploring these homes in the area, is that why you decided to become a historical fiction writer? That history, because each one of your books is based on fact.
Right,
yeah.
I think so. There was just something about being surrounded by that history of Virginia, and my mom was very diligent about taking us to all the sites. She had been in college, she had been a tour guide, and she'd gone to William and Mary College and had been a tour guide in Williamsburg and Jamestown. So we had many, many trips to that, and even though sometimes we fought those, I think that rubbed off on me. And then those old houses, fixing up our old farmhouse, which there were a lot of great stories about the Clopton brothers who had built it and how they had met their untimely deaths, and then these abandoned houses with all these little pieces of history.
And then living in Virginia, the Civil War, you had 2 books on the Civil War, so...
Right. So that was really fun, because at that point I was living in Seattle, had fallen into the job of writing books through my editing job. Was sort of at the right place at the right time. So that was a great excuse to be able to come back to Virginia to do research in the National Archives and the Museum of the Confederacy, all those great places for learning about the Civil War.
So we talked about Singing Hands, but your 4th book, Ghost Girl, tell the viewers about your association with Herbert Hoover and this school, because it's quite fascinating.
Well, when we moved to Iowa in 1993, I remember thinking, what am I going to write about in Iowa? Just wasn't sure where the inspiration would come from. But one of the first places I went to was the Herbert Hoover Museum and Library in West Branch, and quickly started learning about Lou Henry Hoover, and was really impressed with the life that she led and the fact that she spoke Chinese and had basically started the Girl Scouts and had all these adventures with her husband when he was a mining engineer traveling the world. So I decided I wanted to write a biography about Lou Henry Hoover, because there really wasn't one. There was one that was out of print. And I got involved in that, and during that process came across this box of letters that really had never been written about before, that told the story of this tiny school that the Hoovers built in the Blue Ridge Mountains next to their presidential fishing camp. They had started meeting the kids as soon as they came to this area called Camp Rapidan and realized that they didn't have a school, so the Hoovers took their own money and built one. And all the letters that are back and forth from the teacher to Lou Henry Hoover at the White House because she was very much involved in the school, or at the Hoover Library. And they just told this really amazing story about these kids and what they learned. And, you know, a lot of them had grown up, or all of them, I think, in houses without electricity and running water. And then here was the president, their new next-door neighbor, and built this great school that became a community center. So the more I learned about that, the more I thought I would rather write about that than a biography about Lou Henry Hoover, because I thought her story could come out through the book.
And it did.
And it did. And that book started out as a nonfiction book, and then I realized through over a long period of time that it needed to be a novel. And so sort of taught myself about transitioning from nonfiction to fiction in the process of writing that book.
So is the school still?
It's no longer there. Well, actually, it's been picked up and moved and is now a ranger station. And I spent a lot of time with the park rangers because where it was situated is now the Shenandoah National Park. And that's part of the story, is how all the mountain people, after Hoover was president, had to be moved off that property to make room for the park. And there was a lot of bitterness involved in that. So we could never find the exact site of the school, but there are a lot of oral histories left by people who had known the Hoovers during their time there, and I used those. Those are at the Shenandoah Park Archives when I was writing the book.
So then you, after the Hoover book, then it was Here Lies Link.
Well, then it was Singing Hands.
Oh, Singing Hands. That's right. Singing Hands we talked about. And then Here Lies Link.
Yes.
And so you were back in you're still in Iowa City, so you looked around. How did the Black Angel come into your focus?
And the Black Angel, the house that we lived in when we first moved to Iowa City was on the east side of town, very near Hickory Hill Park. And I would jog in that park, and one day took a wrong turn and ended up in Oakland Cemetery, which for some reason, for my first few years of living here, I hadn't really discovered. And it's just such a beautiful historic cemetery. And so on each of my jogs, I would go a little bit farther, and one day ran into the Black Angel, which is quite a sight, and just was intrigued by this strange angel that's 9.5 feet tall. The epitaph on the back was in a foreign language, but I didn't know what that language was.
So you were kind of a sleuth then.
Well, I wasn't thinking book idea, but I was just interested, and I started talking to people who had grown up in Iowa City about trying to find out what's the story, who's really buried there. And people had all sorts of legends that they told, and all the superstitions and funny stories about, visiting the Black Angel on Halloween, but nobody really knew the truth. So I started thinking that I wanted to know, and I went to see this a couple of the staff people at the little office in Oakland Cemetery, and they have so much interest in that statue that they've created their own little brochure with some facts about it. So it had some facts, but not all of them.
I love that book. It's a wonderful book.
It was fun to write.
I'm sure. So when I got to tell you, when I told one of my grandsons that I was going to interview Delia Ray Howard, the writer, and I said, "What do you think I should ask her? And what's a good question?" And he said, "Oh, ask her what she's thinking about writing next."
Oh, that's a good question.
So tell the viewers what is next on your. I know what it is, but they don't, maybe.
Well, it's funny. It's another Iowa story. So I've come from thinking, what am I going to write about Iowa, to having plenty of ideas. But this idea weaves in the history of the pearl button industry in Muscatine, which I knew nothing about and actually didn't discover until I was on a trip to Sanibel, Florida, and there's a wonderful shell museum there called the Bailey Shell Museum. And we took our kids there one rainy day when we couldn't do anything else, and there was one little display that showed a picture of a shell from Muscatine, Iowa, that had perfectly round holes punched out, and it said that this mussel shell was used to make buttons, and that Muscatine was the button capital of the world. So that's when I first found out about that. So the new book weaves in that story.
But there's some conflict, obviously, too.
So, yes, a mystery.
A mystery.
It turns out that 1 out of every 100 mussel shells that were found along the Mississippi River to make these buttons had a pearl in it. And some people made their fortunes just from collecting these pearl slugs. And so that's a little part of the story, too.
Well, when I wanted to read, I couldn't believe Muscatine Button Factory. And I Googled it, and it 37% of the world's buttons used to be made in Muscatine, Iowa.
That's right.
This is we're all looking forward to this book.
Right. It's a haunting story because the rivers were over-harvested, and so that was one reason why that industry died, but also because of the technology for making plastic buttons. So that's part of the story, too.
Great. What label do you prefer? Do you prefer children's writer, a middle grade writer, or a young adult writer? Have you?
Well, it sort of depends who I'm talking to, because some people aren't familiar with that term middle grade, but that's who I write for, 10 to 14-year-olds.
So you prefer to be called a middle grade writer?
Well, it sounds a little awkward, so when people ask what I do, I say I write novels for kids.
Okay.
But middle grade is then there's also young adult, which is sort of considered 14 and up, 13 and 14 up. Okay. So I'm not a young adult writer, but I that's something I would like to do.
Maybe after the button.
Maybe after Finding Fortune, which is the name of the new book.
Okay, Finding Fortune.
Yes.
Good. I read that you made a statement that Iowa City is a really great place to be a children's writer, and you're in a critique group. Tell me about this.
So we try to meet once a month, and we either send our chapters that we're working on by email or drive them around to people's houses so that we've all read them beforehand, and then we meet on a weeknight for a few hours and go over things and spend a lot of time talking about non-publishing related things too.
Good.
Great friends.
I always ask my guest who or what has had a major influence on your life. You mentioned your teacher in high school. Who else has made it?
I would have to say my mother, Bobby, who's just been this huge champion. She was a first grade teacher for more than 30 years. Taught reading for a lot of those years, and so loves to read and loves teaching children about books. And she's just sort of a true blue, not just because she's my mother, but she's someone who I'll call up and tell her I'm working on something, and she'll say, read me that chapter on the telephone. You know, who would want to do that? Listen to a whole chapter on the phone. Well, Bobby would. And when I was writing Singing Hands, she went back to Birmingham with me on the research trip, and just I could call her up at any time and ask advice or family stories. So she's sort of stuck with me through this whole thing.
So you mentioned your husband, Matt, and you married him after you graduated from the University of Virginia.
Yes.
Is there a story how you met him?
Well, sometimes I wish it was a little less cliche, but we met at a fraternity party at the University of Virginia when he was finishing med school and I was finishing undergrad. And we were at this loud party with a band that was just would blast you out of this awful house. And we somehow were standing next to each other and shouting back and forth. And I think I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm going to be a brain surgeon," or something like that. And at the time, I happened to be working for the University of Virginia Hospital Magazine, and I was writing an article about the brain. Can you believe that?
I can't. I mean, I do believe you, but
so when he said this about that he was going off to do his residency in neurosurgery, I said, well, I'm writing an article about the brain. Maybe you could help me.
And the rest is history.
Right.
And you have 3 beautiful daughters. Just briefly say what they're about and where they are.
Well, my oldest daughter, Caroline, who's 22, left a little over a week ago for Belize to work in the capital there, Belmopan. She's doing her student teaching. She started out the first half of her student teaching at Shimmick Elementary here in Iowa City, and the second half is in Belize. And then my middle daughter, Susanna, is 20 and is a junior at Bowdoin College, a chemistry major, thinks maybe she wants to be a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And then our youngest daughter, Lily, is a senior at City High, sort of deciding what her future will be now she's applying to colleges.
I know you love going to schools and talking to students. And are there 1 or 2 recurring questions they ask you? I mean, as you travel from that middle grade area of schools.
Yes, they ask always, how do you get your ideas? Where do you get your ideas? They've also asked, are you rich? Which I am such one thing about writing. I love it so much, but I also enjoy the research so much that I spend a lot of time on the research and take a very long, long time to write a book. So at my pace, I could never be rich as a children's book writer.
So you tell them that.
So I say, no, I am.
Do they ever ask you, what did you read? What did you like to read when you were little or
They do.
young?
And then I always
What
say
do you tell them?
Nancy Drew.
Okay.
What else did I love? All the classics, like The Secret Garden and books like that. But, I always, that's my hardest question when kids ask if I have a favorite book.
I mean, growing up, reading growing up?
Yes, and now I have a very hard time picking my favorite. It always seems to be what I'm reading now.
Reading. I said and mentioned in the introduction that you are on the board of the UNESCO City of Literature, and this book festival is coming. What is this for viewers who might not know about it? Tell us about this.
So the festival is January 11th through the 13th, 2013, and takes place in the Sheraton Hotel downtown in the ballroom. That's will be the venue for the Children's Book Fair, with the main stage with entertainment and a lot of activities, face painting and storybook characters. And then the other part of the festival on Saturday takes place at the Iowa City Public Library, where 10 authors will be presenting about, and we've asked them to focus on where they get their ideas from, because of that being a question that a lot of kids ask. And this festival, the first annual was last year, and now it's really taking off, and kicks off with a big Friday night banquet at the Sheraton that celebrates young authors who have entered a writing contest, and the winners have a chance to read their work at that dinner. And there's also the keynote speaker by a best-selling author, Nancy Krulik, who writes for younger children and older children.
You've been lucky that you've had these very major publishers publish your books, but I assume you see also people who self-publish.
Yes.
And that's
definitely.
Is that part of this festival too?
The speakers at this festival are not self-published, but I see us turning that way in the future, because self-publishing is becoming such it's just having this huge wave of acceptance, and people really want to know about it. And so I think that's something that we'll work toward in 2014.
So we're going to look forward to having this festival hopefully every year.
Yes,
Great.
And it's one of the signature events for the City of Literature.
Great. My last question, and what's the best part of living in Iowa City? What do you like? What do you like the best?
Well, I love. You and I have talked about how there's so much to do, so many. Seems like something every night, whether it's at Prairie Lights or the Englert, and having this mixing ground of all these authors and artists and musicians. I love that. I love living in a university town. I think after being here and seeing what that feels like and the atmosphere with the students and the people in the community, I wouldn't want to live in any place that wasn't a university town. So I think that's the best part.
Well, on that very positive note, thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you.
My guest on One of a Kind has been the author of books for middle school readers, Delia Ray Howard. She has published 6 books and is currently writing her 7th. She loves going to schools and talking about writing. Words used to describe my guest are magnetic, compassionate, a thorough researcher, very bright, charming, and kind. Delia Ray Howard is one of a kind.